All right, everybody. Here we are. I'm here with Suge. Suge, how you feeling?
Oh man, Mike, it's been a tough week, man. Did you know last week our fan club broke up?
I wasn't aware. My secretary didn't tell me.
Yeah. That one guy, he died.
Okay. But here we are, episode 53, aka.
Showed me the Paul Mooney.
Okay, out of respect to the godfather of comedy, as he was told, Mr. Paul Mooney, uh, passed away this week at 79. Of course, every time we do an episode, I feel like we're doing a tribute one way or another with different individuals. But today is important because I feel like we've mentioned Paul Mooney several times. I think we mentioned him last week too, uh, especially with Mindful of Comedy. Something that's up on YouTube now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're really into stand up comedy. One of our first episodes we ever did for Shook Me the Mooney, we mentioned the Artie Lang fiasco situation. But yeah, with Paul Mooney, no relation. Uh, he is less known than, let's say, like a Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy or like George Carlin, people of that tier. But if you are familiar, or if you actually do some research and find out that he was kind of the man behind a lot of these individuals,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I'm gonna get into his whole bio and everything. But Chug, uh, what's your what did Paul mean? What does Mooney mean to you?
Well, first of all, the one person I first thought of when outside of Paul Mooney when he passed away was Dave Chappelle because I was 12 between the ages of like 12 and 14 when Chappelle show came out, and he introduced me to Paul Mooney, the man, the myth, the legend, and um it's just incredible. Like Dave Chappelle got his own show, and one of the first things he did was like he brought like a comedic legend who was unbeknownst to a lot of people out to the forefront. Like, and he introduced him. It's like he wrote for Richard Pryor, all of this stuff. He was huge, and like the third person I thought of was John Witherspoon, who we also lost last year. A lot of these guys, you know them from being like minor, like in the narrative version, in a narrative way. John Witherspoon from being on Wayne's Brothers and being in Boomerang and House Party and stuff like that. You know them from being like side characters, and Paul Mooney from being on Chappelle Show. You know them from just appearing on these shows, but in the late '70s and early '80s, when really only like Richard Pryor and like Red Fox were like the only huge black comedians. These were the guys on like that next level that were really behind and working with these guys. So Paul Mooney meant a lot to me, and the joke of his that I always remembered, and I think Mike, you remember me saying this a lot when we were working, when it was like a vagrant, like white
Mm.
dude walking in. I'd be like, oh my god, what a waste of white skin.
Yeah, and my joke that I always bring up, and I bring up like in as a joke and as serious, was the complexion for the protection.
Hmm.
Yeah, and because that's from the a famous stand-up special he had that I watched like all the time late at night. I think it was on Showtime, and he had that delivery where he act like he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he'd be like, "Who's that guy? Who's that guy with the he's wearing the ECW hat and the guy like he's like describing me, right?" And then someone in the audience will shout out like, Michael," he'll mention my name. Like, "Oh, aren't you sick of him?" And then like that's like he had that communal vibe uh, that it actually had kind of like roots with like the black clubs in stand-up comedy. Another thing that I first saw him in was Spike Lee's Bamboozled.
Okay.
Remember he played that character,
I
and
missed it in years, so
yeah,
you
so
gotta forgive me.
he is a relative. I forget the actual relations between Damon Wayans' character and Paul Mooney, but he kind of they have a moment in the movie where he's kind of gives him the idea to do because Damon Wayans' character, which is a theme in Paul Mooney's work too, is he can't get past. There's a ceiling, and he works in media and TV, and there's a ceiling that he's trying to go through, and he creates a show that's kind of like a modern day minstrel show. That's the story of Bamboozled. Uh, but it just has a historical like black comedy clubs. That's how a lot of their like someone sitting on a stool, very very back and forth with the crowd. Sometimes stand up is very regimental and it's just like that's called heckling, but they had like people yell in the crowd and it was like part of the show. You mentioned Red Fox and Richard Pryor, so like he met Richard Pryor in 1968 when he was starting his career. Uh, Richard Pryor show, we brought that up quite recently. He was a writer for that show, and then he was also a writer for Sanford and Son, which is like everyone remembers Red Fox in the show, but people in the writing room you might not remember, you might not know, and that was Paul Mooney. He another role he had was a rewriter for SNL and the show Fridays, which was like a different version of SNL. Shug, you sent me the clip recently. Very
Actually,
iconic, yeah, very iconic sketch between Chevy Chase and
I
Richard
did
Pryor.
not know until Paul Mooney died a few days ago. I did not know that was him who wrote that. But the thing about Richard Pryor, the great thing about Richard Pryor is like when you look up the Richard Pryor and you look up the cast list, like you see a Paul Mooney, you see a John Witherspoon, you see a Robin Williams. So if anything proves that real recognize real, look at the cast list on the Richard Pryor show and the people that wrote for Richard Pryor. Because as great of a comedian as Richard Pryor was, like he was the person I saw talent in all these other great comedic people.
And guess what? Another thing I didn't know until now, doing my research, something that we both grew up on. Homie the Clown is credited to Paul Mooney. Homie
Okay.
the Clown from In Living Color. What a great character
I
that's
could see
still,
it, yeah.
yeah, right. Homie, don't play that.
Hmm.
Like I can just like that's one of the great characters that's 30 years old, 30 years plus. And In Living Color kind of is much of a show like the Richard Pryor where you had like a Robin Williams, you had a Jim Carrey. It was very like that. It just was about like talent. And then another thing, me and you growing up, we had the Chappelle show. Ask a Black Man was one of the bits, right? And Nico
Hmm.
Damas was another one.
I know one of the things you said, and it's something that we kind of like touched on a little bit in the episode before the last one where we were talking about people using basically like the cultural appropriation thing, and Paul Mooney had the best phrase for that, especially when you're talking about like white people who try to take over, um try to use black culture to like boost themselves. I forgot this girl's name. What's her name? The one from TikTok. Now, like she stole all the TikTok dances from the I don't know. She got like a very like white girl name, and then
mm,
you talking about like Miley Cyrus.
mm,
And the term the phrase he said, he was like, everybody want to be a nigga, but don't want to be a nigga. Meaning, like a lot of people want to take, the black, like the other thing, the thing he said directly after it was, the black man is the most mimicked person in the world, but also the most like vilified person in the world at the same time. So a lot of people, they want to use our like coolness and our culture and stuff like that to like push themselves forward. But then when it comes to actual black issues, like these people like nowhere to be found, or they'll do a lot of like performative allyship. Oh,
mm.
I put Black Lives Matter in my bio, so I care about black people rather than, all right, I'm gonna use my platforms like much in the same way that like David Bowie, first thing
Mm.
he did when he got on MTV, does an interview and he's like, why do you not have black people on your channel? It's like, and the interview is like, I don't know. Maybe our audience is probably not ready for that. And it's like, well, Michael Jackson has sold more records than I have, but you show me, like that was like actual allyship.
Mm.
And Miley Cyrus, she was doing all that ass shaking and all that shit, but I didn't see her in like Ferguson or at any like Black Lives Matter rallies. So that's what he meant by what he said.
Right. I think back then he was talking about like Justin Timberlake a lot. It was like everything but like the stress or something like that. I forgot what he would say a lot of things like that. I never watched the show. Were you a fan? Because we're talking about Richard Pryor. We're talking about uh Robert Townsend. We're talking about like Eddie Murphy, Dave Chappelle. But he also worked on a show that had Kevin Hart. Right? Remember that show, The Real Husbands of Hollywood?
Yeah,
Apparently,
yeah, I was a fan of
he worked on that as well. Apparently, like
that.
he has credits on that. So that's only 10 years ago. While he was promoting that show, he there's a quote, the most recent quote. It was like from 10 years ago. He said, "Everyone has finally caught up with me. When I did it, it wasn't popular. I was considered a troublemaker." He used a lot of words like that, like troublemaker. I was making a fuss and everything. Hollywood now is acting like it's all new. That's something I always bring up too, where like something happened now, and people are thinking like it's the first time it happened.
Hmm.
But it's generational though.
I feel like it's sometimes it's like the dude that busts down the door, and then when he busts down the door, like the security guards, like they beat the shit out of him.
Mm,
But then the people that are inside the room, they look at like him getting beat up by the security guards, and it's like, oh, this is kind of messed up. I think we should start letting other people in.
mm,
And then people forget the fact that like this dude bust down the door and opened the door for you guys
mm.
and made it easier for you to come in and do what you're doing now. And I think Paul Mooney is definitely one of those people.
Yeah, so again, generational, like 70s. He has a lot of famous classic moments. In like in the 80s, and we talked about Living Color. Another show that I'm a big fan of. I rewatched it a bunch of times. It's the Larry Sanders Show. Because I love like the whole like late night talk show scene and everything. Paul Mooney plays a character in one of the episodes. Larry Sanders, played by Gary Shandling. He's a
R.I.P. as
very
well.
R.I.P. Another one. Yeah. He's like a needy person, with just like a mess. Like, until he goes out on stage, he's just like a total mess. So Beverly is his personal assistant who does everything for him, a black woman. And so they do a lot of jokes, no, not jokes, but they touched on a lot of like stuff that was going on. A lot of things that are going on now was being touched on in the 90s. This is like mid 90s. But one of the episodes, her cousin shows up, and it's Paul Mooney, and he works for like Baltimore public access or something like that, like a city's public access news. And he's like, "Hey, try to get me a job here in LA. I want to work here." And she's like, kind of, "Why are you nervous? Ask him. Can you do everything for him? Let him do you a favor. Like, come on, try to get me a job." Sort of like that. And then Gary Shandling, Larry Sanders is like, "Does he have experience?" "Yeah, he works for the public access, PBS type in Baltimore." And he's kind of like, That's not good enough for like uh Tonight Show type show." And basically, the point of that scene and that episode arc is that how can he have experience on a big show like that if you don't give him the opportunity? So
Hmm.
that was kind of like, this was like mid '90s, and affirmative action was a big deal. So that was kind of like, Paul Mooney was doing that, and I grew up watching
That's
that show, so I was in my head.
yeah, it's relevant today because a lot of
Exactly.
places, where black people, wouldn't get an opportunity, it's because they'll say like this person is an experience or they're not this or they're not that, and it's like meanwhile like Conan O'Brien's like nephew is an intern on these shows and he has experience because somebody told him like, oh, that's Conan O'Brien's nephew.
Guess what? And there's an episode of Larry Sanders that's just about that. It's Gary Shandling's Larry Sanders is executive producer, gets his son a gig as like a runner, like an intern, and it's
Mhm.
Colin Quinn. I have his book right here, but Colin Quinn, and he doesn't want to be there. He fucks everything up, and he keeps getting all these opportunities. He doesn't want to be there. He openly says like, I just took an hour, 2 hour, whatever. Like the yogurt's all messed up, but they can't fire him. Like he has that complexion for the protection, like straight up. But yeah, I mean, again, I love watching that show because it's about behind the scenes, and Paul Mooney was always behind the scenes working on things. Eventually, his face got out there, but a lot of his work up until the last few stand-ups I saw in the last 15 years, 20 years was about representation, not
Mhm.
just in front of the camera, but behind. Because like you brought up before, like niceties, or just like the what's the word you used for like uh it looks like you're doing something, but you're not. Like you mentioned it before, like the niceties of like, oh, miming, like you're doing something just for the show of it. You're not really getting anything done. But when you're behind the
Performative.
performative, okay.
Yeah.
But he talked about behind the scenes, we're getting people behind the camera, a lot more things can get done, and it's interesting that this comes up because one of the topics we're also going to talk about today has to do with Suge's new favorite show, the Bachelor franchise, Bachelor, Bachelorette. But we're going to talk about
That was a
a
bit of
few
a
years ago.
stretch.
Well, you find it very interesting. Let's just put it
Yeah.
there. So Rachel Lindsay was. We'll get into who she is, but she was one of the first Bachelorette of color,
The
and
first.
she the first. Yes,
Mhm.
there's only 3 people we can talk about, but we're gonna get into that because what she has to say about the franchise and her role in it
I'm a,
has to
I'm
do with in front of the camera and behind the camera.
I'm gonna do a lot of apologizing when we get to that.
Yeah, so that's up on the. We're
Cause
gonna talk about
I
that.
like to admit when I'm wrong. I think this doesn't really have nothing much to do with anything, but I think a lot of people don't like to be wrong. But being wrong is like a beautiful thing because it's something. It's an opportunity to learn. It's an extra educational moment. Um, I'd rather people accept being wrong and trying to learn from it rather than being wrong and strong, which is basically just, "Oh, I'm wrong. What? You know what? Listen, I don't care. This is the way I do things. This is why I say things, blah, 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 blah." So, and not when we get there, like, I will admit I was wrong.
If we had the an intern or someone just willing to write down everything we say, we could look it up. We would actually make side by side, like, oh, I said this, but no, I was wrong. But we don't have that time right now. So just take our
Yeah,
word
I
for it.
mean,
Take our
listen,
word for it. We do
uh,
if we knew we knew. We
when
would
you
see it.
see what I say, you could watch the episode of The Bachelor on Race on YouTube. It's its own episode. It's about like 45 minutes long. You could skip through, I don't care. But you will see what I'm talking about when I get there.